So hello everyone and welcome to the 2020 Christian Publishing Online Summit. This webinar series features 12 acquisition editors and publishing industry executives from a variety of Christian publishing houses, all discussing various aspects of writing and getting published. The live webinars will take place through the end of this month, but recordings will also be available on the Writing for Your Life website thereafter. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to let you know that you can ask questions through the chat feature of the Zoom webinar. Just type in your questions and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. So today our guest is our good friend Vinita Hampton Wright. Vinita has edited books for Loyola Press, the Jesuit ministry, for 21 years, serving as managing editor in recent years. She's published her own fiction and nonfiction, including the most recent Small Simple Ways, an Ignatian daybook for healthy spiritual living. This is just an excellent book. I read it on my vacation recently, and I very, very highly recommend it. So Vinita has helped lead several small groups through the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius and is currently completing requirements for certification as a spiritual director through Loyola University. She's a regular contributor to the Loyola Press blog, www.ignatianspirituality.com. And for more than 2 decades, she has led retreats and workshops on writing, creativity, prayer, and Ignatian spirituality. She lives with her husband, Jim, and their 2 dogs and 2 cats on the Chicago South Side. And I just have to say, Vinita is one of the most highly respected editors in this industry and has been a featured speaker at several of our conferences. So she's a strong supporter of Writing for Your Life and publishing in color, and I'm very glad to have her with us here today. So welcome, Vinita.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to see you and good to be here today. I am going to be talking about the art of spiritual writing. And I did write a book called this, The Art of Spiritual Writing. And I'll show you a picture of it in a minute on the PowerPoint. And I want you to know that I will be talking about some things that are in the book, but really this is a fresh presentation. There are things in the book that you can they go into much more detail about certain aspects of writing for a spirituality audience. And so today I'm going to be talking about that experience, but not directly from the book. So if you've read the book already, you'll still get new stuff today. And if you enjoy this presentation today, then I suggest that you get the book, because essentially it's 20 plus years of my experience, all in not that many pages. It's really designed to be a handbook for writers. So I'm going to be leading you through. PowerPoint is not my first gift. Working with words is. So this is a webinar for people who desire to bring wise words to the world. And I apologize that you've got the strip there on the left, but that's what we have. And again, there's the photo of of the book, The Art of Spiritual Writing. You can get that at Amazon. I mean, you can get it all over the place. So you can also order it through the Loyola Press website, because I did publish that through the publishing company I work for, Loyola Press here in Chicago. Okay, let's first talk about what we mean by spiritual writing. Now, I think that any writing that comes from the heart comes from a place of truthfulness in any person, and is meant for any kind of growth or learning or understanding, is inherently spiritual. Because I am convinced that, having worked with many writers over the years, had lots of discussions with artists of a lot of different disciplines, and done my own work, I'm just convinced that the creative process itself is a part of our spiritual makeup. And so in that broad sense, a lot of writing I would consider spiritual. But for our purposes today, what I call spiritual writing is what a person communicates with the intention of addressing matters of the spirit. And this can go across all kinds of spiritual disciplines. You know, you can be a Buddhist spirituality writer, or, you know, Islamic, or Jewish, or agnostic, I mean, whatever. But of course, I come from a specifically Christian viewpoint. However, what I talk about today really applies across the board. So if you are trying to do writing that communicates in a very intentional way matters of the spirit, then I would say that what you're doing or trying to do is spiritual writing. So we're going to talk about 3 topics today, and one is the writer himself or herself. The second is the writing process, and the third is the product of the writing. And those are 3 very distinctive aspects of spirituality writing. You really have to look at them separately before you can consider how they work together. So first we're going to talk about the writer. Okay, here's a question that I get at conferences all the time, or I know people are asking the question who are trying to write, say, when can I call myself a writer? And I'm going to just be kind of blunt here and say, you can call yourself a writer whenever you want to. You know, if you want to write, if you enjoy writing, if you consider yourself a writer, then call yourself a writer. And actually, you're probably the only person who really cares whether you call yourself a writer or not. It's just a matter of how you want to see yourself. Now, to tell you the truth, I've been writing for decades now, but when someone I don't know asks me what I do for a living, I never say that I'm a writer, because then that kind of starts the very awkward 20 questions thing, you know. Oh, really? Well, what have you written? Well, would I have found that in the New York Times book review? You know, and on and on and on. And it just gets to be awkward. And so I tell people I'm an editor, or I lead retreats or whatever. So I know I'm a writer, but do I call myself a writer to other people? Not necessarily, because then it just kind of opens up something that I would, especially as an introvert and as a writer, I don't want to talk about what I'm working on right now, because the minute you say that, you'll say, well, what are you working on now? Tell me about it. And I don't know about you, but a lot of us writers, that's the last question we want to hear. Do not ask me, what are you writing, and tell me about it, because if I'm working on it now, it's still in formation stage. It's rather fragile in my world, and I don't want anybody messing with it. I need it to develop as it needs to develop. So anyway, just to get that out of the way, call yourself a writer if you want. It's really entirely up to you, but it's not the issue. A writer, the spirituality writer, is someone who writes with spiritual intent. We've already talked about that. Now, the spirituality writer holds a proper view of himself and his gifts. And I want to go into that a little bit. What is the proper view? A spirituality writer, his writing is not ego-driven, but it's fueled by a desire for truth, compassion, and forward movement in himself and in others. He understands that his gift with words is indeed a gift and must be used with wisdom and discernment. And we'll talk a little more about discernment later. So holding a proper view of yourself as a writer, it's important, first of all, that you embrace your gifts. If you're gifted with words, then own that. Own that. There's nothing wrong with it. That's God-given, and you'll develop faster and further if you just own that and claim it and say, yeah, I have a gift with words. I'm improving on it all the time. I still need to learn how to write better all the time. I have a lot to learn. I'll be a student the rest of my life as a writer. However, I know that I am gifted when it comes to putting words together. So that's a proper view of yourself and your gifts. But also the proper view is this: anything I'm working on is bigger than I am. Any inspiration I receive is a gift. And I know that I'm still learning. And if I am driven by my ego, constantly saying this has got to be the best ever, or, you know, trying to control how it's going to turn out too much, then that really gets in the way. You're not holding a proper view of your gifts. You're trying to control them too much. You're trying to make everything turn out a certain way. And trust me, in a creative process, that's just not the way it works. So you own that you have a gift. You dedicate yourself to that gift. Say, I'm going to develop as a writer since this is my gift. I'm going to work on it. I'm going to get the help I need. I'm going to do seminars. I'm going to take courses. I'm going to buy a book on copy editing, figure out what is this thing called grammar and punctuation, you know, all of that stuff. So I'm going to use this gift responsibly. And I also recognize that it is a gift, and any work that I am creating, that also is a gift, and it has its own process and its own way of evolving. And so I'm not going to try to force my way on it. I'm not going to, you know, be ego driven with this. I'm going to be spirit led with this. It's a very different approach. So that's how the spirituality writer holds a proper view of himself or herself and those gifts. This fourth point is can be a little touchy, especially for us introverts, but it's totally true. The spirituality writer does not work in a vacuum. She writes in connection with the broader community. Now, this means that she pays attention to what goes on in the world, what goes on in her own neighborhood. She spends regular time in solitude, processing her own life, and in the case of a Christian or other religious person, communing with God as part of her process, but she also remains connected to and focused upon others. And her life with others helps to inform her writing. Now, this is the kind of topic that is ripe for discussion if you're in a writer's group. Talk to one another about, well, how do I interact with community, and how does community really inform what I do? Because honestly, a writer, you spend hours by yourself. I mean, you have to. Even if you go out and sit in a coffee shop to do your work, you're still in a space of privacy and solitude when you're doing your work. So how does community inform that work? I have just a few ideas on that. One thing is that you're paying attention to what's going on around you, whether that's the table, the people at the table next to you, or what's going on continents away in the world. You cannot disconnect from the reality of life here and elsewhere. And I, as a Christian, I believe that the Holy Spirit will use all the things you pay attention to inform your writing, to make it deeper, make it more compassionate, empathetic, make it truer to a bigger picture rather than true for just like a small section of humanity. We do tend to write in our own spaces in the world, and it's very easy to just consider everything you know really well when you're writing. A good writer, an experienced writer, learns to make herself uncomfortable sometimes. Read works from other countries, or simply become more acquainted with people who are different from her, whose lives are quite different from hers. And this informs your writing so that you're not proclaiming a truth that has been narrowed to suit a certain group of people. Now also, you don't work in a vacuum because you do have your community. You may have a spouse or partner, you may have an extended family, you may belong to a faith community, and you may be involved in your community in other ways, or you're at a workplace, so that's part of your community. And it's surprising how many times, I'll hear someone else say something just in a conversation, not anything special, really. They're not talking about my writing, but what they say really rings a bell for me, and I'm thinking, yeah, I need to pay attention to that. so there's the information, the material out in the community that helps inform what you're writing. But there's also, the company of other people with you as you write. It's not unusual for a writer to have kind of a tough time finding her community, depending on what tradition you come out of. Some of us come out of a tradition that's pretty narrow in terms of what is good to write about, or wanting a certain biblical worldview to be very evident in anything they write. And so for those of us who are really growing in our art, and the creative work is always going to, not always, but eventually it takes you to the margins. It takes you to the questions. That's part of what creative work is. And so if you come out of a community, religious or otherwise, that is uncomfortable with questions, uncomfortable with things being said a little differently than how they're used to, then you may not find your community there. Sometimes a writer finds her community with other writers through email and websites and blogs. We have the opportunity to connect with so many people now that we could not have connected with years ago. So your community for your own benefit, companionship, somebody you can talk with about your work when it's time to talk about it. Someone, to be really specific, sometimes the creative work is difficult. It takes you to painful places or complex places. And it doesn't hurt to have someone praying for you as you do this work, because it is a very spiritual process. So your community can be, one or two people who pray for you as you're working on something. They can be the people who encourage you. One or two of them may even be people who will read what you have from time to time. You say, just give me your take on this. I'm not asking for an edit. Just, do you even like this character? Or can you tell can you get the point I'm making here? Just feedback from time to time. So don't despair if you don't have a community right around you, at least at this point. Know that there is a community out there for you, though. And a community can be one person or maybe two or three people, that you connect with over email on a regular basis. But do not underestimate the importance of that community. You need it for your well-being. You need it for just companionship in your work, especially since an artist's work is done so often in solitude. You do need you need companionship. And some of us don't need lots of it. I am a classic introvert. I really don't feel the need for companionship a lot of the time, but I know when I need it. And I have learned to not feel lesser or weak or ashamed when I need the companionship of someone, especially when I'm going through a rough time of unpacking something and writing about it. So the spirituality writer writes with spiritual intent. Now, this does not necessarily mean that you're using religious language. That's a certain kind of writing. But spirituality writing does not always use religious language. It just really depends on what you're writing and who you're writing to. So I wanted to clarify that. The spirituality writer holds a proper view of himself and his gifts. You own your gifts, you receive them. You also hold them lightly. You go about them with humility and always a learner's attitude. And the spirituality writer does not work in a vacuum. He or she takes in information all the time around her in the world, and also finds community when he needs it. All right. And as you have questions, feel free to put it on the chat, and we will make sure your questions get answered, or at least I'll try. Okay, the writing process involves engagement, practices, and movement. Okay, let's start with the first one. The engagement is the writer learns how best to engage with his creativity. He understands that this engagement requires energy, close attention, and self-awareness. A maturing writer continues to develop his ability to sit with his deeper wisdom, to face the truth about himself and the world. He allows adequate time and emotional, mental space to do his work. I think one of the main reasons that we procrastinate, and every writer does this, is that we have learned over time that engagement costs us. You're using a lot of energy when you really engage with your creativity. You're diving down in there, you're confronting all kinds of emotions and memories and questions, and it's not for the faint-hearted. It really isn't. But engagement means that you really attend to it. You get in there and you stay with it. And sometimes it means that you write for an hour and you look at it and it's not great at all. In fact, you'll probably never use it, but you have engaged with the topic, and you are that much closer. You are an hour closer, an hour's worth of writing closer to what you need to write. So engagement means that you are not worried about being productive. You're not worried about wasting time. You are simply dedicated to getting into this process and grappling with it and being there with it. Okay, and practices. The writer develops various practices by which to engage with her creative process. She learns the best time and place for doing her work. She pays attention to rituals that help her center and focus on the work. Rituals such as lighting a candle, setting out certain objects or photographs, beginning with a prayer or breathing meditation, putting on music that helps her relax into the work. And when a practice stops working, she lets it go and tries something else, understanding that a practice is a means to an end, not the end itself. Now, I know that at different writers' conferences and probably in books too, sometimes a writer will say, you must do this, this, and this. These are the steps for being a good writer. And the minute they say you must do, I say I must stop reading this because you don't know what my process is like. Now, granted, some things are fairly uniform for a lot of people, such as turning up, having some kind of a habit, going to a specific place at a specific time. For many of us, that works best. But the minute something becomes a law that you must obey or the writing won't work, you're going to short circuit your creative process. So a practice is just simply something that helps you engage. And for some people, being in a quiet place with maybe a little music in the background is helpful. Lighting a candle, having some kind of incense in the room, or whatever. They really need that very sacred feeling, quiet space, and they start with meditation or whatever. I know a number of writers who their practice is to sit in a coffee shop for like 2 hours a day, and somehow all the noise and activity around them is a stimulus, and they do really well at that. So figure out the practices that work for you. And understand that at a certain time in your life, a breathing meditation may really get you going. And a few years from now, it's like, no, that's not helpful to me anymore. What I really need to do is to make myself a cup of coffee and sit in this chair rather than sit at the desk. So my philosophy of practices is to have a big bag full of them and use them as they work for you, and when they don't work, stop using them. Now, that doesn't mean that you just go in and out of writing very sporadically. That's not what I'm saying. You develop the practices that help you. And any practice is going to take time to get established too. So, any kind of habit you build, it takes a number of times before that really becomes a good practice for you. But just look at, what helps you and what does not help you. And pay attention to that, and you'll be surprised at how that helps. Okay, movement. The writer develops the ability to see when a work is progressing or not. When and for what reason does the writer become stuck? Is there an issue that needs attention for this work to move forward? Is there a natural rhythm of work, rest, reflection, and revision that must be acknowledged? Sometimes we try to push forward and write when it's time to rest from the writing and allow the inner process to generate material. Or it's time to stop writing and reflect on what we've already written. Or it's time to go back to what we've written so far and begin editing it. A writer must learn to understand what is called for on a particular day. There are movements in your writing process. For instance, when I'm in the very early stages of working on a project, I'll do a lot of walking. I walk outdoors. I love to walk anyway. It's just good for me. I've always enjoyed it, and it's always fed me. And so in the beginning of a process, now I'll carry a journal. I may or may not write in it, but I use the walking time to just kind of think about this new project. Now, several months into working on the project, if I'm spending hours walking, I'm actually wasting time because it's not helping me. It's just giving me something to do to avoid working on something that's become complex, because every writing project at some point gets really messy and complex, and you really wish you could just start a whole other project, because this just feels messy and you don't know, you can't see the end. And now this is natural. This is the way things happen. But that's when you need to understand, okay, am I moving forward in this? Am I stuck? If I'm stuck, why am I stuck? It may be very practical. Maybe you've realized, you're working on a novel and you've reviewed the last couple chapters, and it occurs to you that you really stink at writing dialogue. And you don't know what to do with that. It says, well, I did the best I could. What do I do? Well, probably what you need to do is find a few books or go to, websites or blogs or whatever on writing and learn about the basics of writing good dialogue. So you need to stop your writing a bit, go do some learning. What my piano teacher used to call woodshed it. You really dig down and work on it. So sometimes it's a very simple thing that you are avoiding that can help you move forward. So paying attention to what the movement is in your life, in your creative process, is really key. Okay, the product of the writing. This is probably what a lot of people really want to hear about. We don't like to hear about process and practices. We just want to figure out, can I get this published? So let me give you a rundown on what generally happens if something goes further than just your personal writing. The first thing that happens is the writer engages with the material, and after much work and struggle, gets it written down. That's just the first part of the process. The second is the writer then allows himself time to let the material rest, then goes back to it with fresh editorial eyes to see what he has and what he still needs to do with it. So you write, you get away from it a bit, you go back, you look at it and say, okay, what do I have here? The third step, the writer takes the rough draft to the next draft based on her reflection and editorial assessment. So, you have more than just the first draft here. Then the writer seeks feedback from an editor, publisher, or other professional who can help him envision how this material might be presented to the wider public. And then the writer, along with others in a collaborative process, such as editor, agent, transforms what first was personal writing into public writing. She rewrites the material so that it is no longer as self-focused as it is others-focused. Now, what I've found and experienced many times is that we like to go from step 1 to step 5. We like to think we can do that. There are a few really gifted writers that might work for. And frankly, after someone becomes a bestseller and famous, sometimes they get to skip that because they have the benefit of the doubt of the publisher. But truthfully, all of this needs to happen in some form or another. You have the first draft, you struggle and you work, you get the first draft written down, and then basically most of us, including those of us who are professional writers, what we have here now is this holy mess and we've got to sort it out and figure out, okay, what is this really? Have I actually written 2 books and they're kind of merged together? Who is this book for, etc. And so then you take it to another draft. And then when you feel like you know what you're doing with it, you begin to get feedback. And then eventually, if it's meant to see a wider audience, that's when the publishing process comes in. So, important truth 1. In the divine scheme of things, the writing you do is first of all for your own benefit. Your God-given gifts work on you first. Just think of it. You are the first witness to the marvelous stuff that you write. In the privacy of your own study, you're the first witness. You're the first one this writing touches. Thus, the initial draft of anything is really for you. You might work on a book for several years before the first draft is completed. All of that is for you, your growth as a person and as a writer. I think we forget that sometimes, especially those of us who are ministry-minded. We want to think that we're doing something for the world, and that's fine. And eventually, yeah, we do a lot of things for the world, but we forget that there's still all this stuff that needs to happen within us, our own transformation. Important truth number 2. And people don't like to hear this, but I'm sorry, I'm an editor, I've got to tell you. Inspiration does not override undeveloped craft. The written word is a craft and an art, and a writer's wisdom cannot be communicated sufficiently through bad writing. If you believe that you are called to write for others, then you must be working at writing better all the time. I buy at least 1, if not more, books on writing every year. I buy books on grammar, on everything, nuts and bolts. I buy books on editing. I don't always read them right away, but I do read them. I mean, I do go to them at certain times. Sometimes when I'm getting ready to work on a project and it's still kind of forming within me and I'm not really ready to write it yet, I will go back and do just a basic review of how to put a sentence together. And I have been doing this for almost 30 years now, and I still find that I need to review. If you cannot put a sentence together in the most effective way, the greatest truths and inspiration you have to offer, they're not going to get where you want them to go. Number 3, the ministry or benefit to others occurs in the revision of the material as you turn your focus away from your own growth and understanding and toward the needs and desires of others. And again, a lot of us are ministry minded. We want to jump right to the ministry part, but most of the time our work needs to be adjusted so that it stops being just my story, my understanding, and I shape it so that it will be most easily received and understood by other people. Important truth number 4. Most writers will produce a lot of material that never goes on to the ministry stage. This is as it should be. If you consider yourself a spirituality writer, then prepare to allow many of your words to remain private. You needed them, but the public does not need to receive them from you. Like with anything, so much of my writing life, it's about my own development as a person, as a writer, as a Christian, and it will never see the light of day in terms of being published or other people reading it. I have short stories I still reread every few years because I love them, but they're not publishable. They're just not, they don't quite hit the criteria I would want them to be published anywhere. But I still receive good from them. So we have to be willing to say, you know what, this is fine. It doesn't have to go any further. And important truth number 5, because you process your life and spirituality through writing, consider it another form of prayer. Don't be afraid to approach your writing life as your spiritual life. I think it's a really good practice when you're working on something to ask in prayer, Lord, why this project? Why me and why now? What's going on here? Why is this important for me to write about? And then the rest of your prayer can be, please teach me through this. help me to receive what is here to receive from working on this magazine article or this book or journaling for the past few weeks. It is a form of prayer. And the beauty of it is sometimes it's a prayer that we end up sharing with others. And that's the really cool thing, because when people come back to you after reading something you've written, whether it's a blog post or a book, you realize that, wow, you know, I really benefited from working on this, but it's just so humbling to me that this has had such a wonderful impact on other people. So that's what we're talking about with spirituality writing. There's so much more to say, but that's the end of my presentation for today. And again, there's more detail and more topics in the book itself, The Art of Spiritual Writing. I'll slip back up here to let you see that picture again. And I will hand it over to you, Brian.
So let's see. One of the folks had a little computer glitch, and they're asking if you could show important truths number 3 and 4 again.
Sure. Okay, let me go down here. There's number 3. The ministry or benefit to others occurs in the revision of the material as you turn your focus away from your own growth and understanding and toward the needs and desires of others. And number 4, and most writers will produce a lot of material that never goes on to the ministry stage, which is fine. And something that we just accept and are grateful for.
So thank you so much, Vinita. This was really, helpful. And this presentation is much different than many of the other presentations that we've had in this summit, in that, I asked a lot of the folks that are acquisitions editors to focus on various aspects of getting published, whereas you're really focusing heavily specifically on spiritual writing, which obviously is the whole reason for doing this in the first place. So, so thank you very much for that.
Oh, my pleasure.
And you've gone into depth on this particular book, and we mentioned Small Simple Ways, which is your more recent book. But I'd also like to talk for a moment, if we could, about The Soul Tells a Story. For those of you who follow the Writing for Your Life blog, you've seen many excerpts from that book. But Vinita, could you tell us a little bit about kind of how that book relates to The Art of Spiritual Writing? Oh,
sure. Do you know the copyright date on that, Brian? I wrote that years ago.
I think I can get to it quickly. 2005.
Okay.
University Press.
Yep. And I wrote that out of the retreat work I was doing and the workshops I was doing with writers at the time. I was doing what I thought would just be writing workshops. And of course they were with writers of spirituality, because mainly it was like at Catholic retreat centers and it was all Christian. And so talking with so many people and working with them, I came to understand that, this is a spiritual process, and we can't really separate our writing from the rest of our lives. And also, we have a lot to learn about paying attention to the creative process, because what I was learning that a lot of writers had not figured out was that they had a process, that it wasn't necessarily like the process of their favorite writers. A lot of us, we have a favorite writer. If they write a book on writing, we pick it up and then we try to do exactly what they did. And we learned that it doesn't work. So out of all those workshops, I developed the book called The Soul Tells a Story, and it was about engaging with creativity and spirituality in the writing life. So it's more about the process. I talk some about the process today, but The Soul Tells a Story goes into a lot of detail. And Brian, I look at it from time to time and I realize, I'd write the same thing today. I mean, it was really, I might add a few things, but in terms of the content of that book, even though it's how old now? I mean, it's an older book. I consider it seminal in terms of what I have learned about writing and the interior process that happens. I talk about things such as self-care for writers or for any artists. Why sometimes we are more sensitive to things like depression or anxiety, because as we develop our artistic work, we become more sensitive in general, and so we get bruised easily in the world. So there's a whole chapter on self-care, um, and so the difference between that and the art of spiritual writing, the art of spiritual writing is really boiled down. It's not meant to be inspirational at all. It's very cut and dried. I didn't try to write beautifully or anything. I just wanted to, okay, here's what you need to know about how to write for other people, how to turn personal writing into public writing. And it's boiled down from my 3 decades of experience as an editor. So it has more to do with working with your material in a way that can turn it into something that's usable to other people, and what we hope publishable, with a publishing company or some other venue. So the art of the spiritual writing is more of a handbook. The Soul Tells a Story, I think, I wrote it to be very encouraging, inspirational, and to help people work with their processes better.
Well, I totally agree with your point about the things that you wrote in The Soul Tells a Story being timeless, and that's why I have excerpted so many passages from that book, because it's both timeless and practical, and I have felt that what you had to say there was, just incredibly useful for spiritual writers. So anyway.
Thank you.
So one thing, can you go back to your important truth number 3 for a moment?
Sure.
Because this is one of the things I find that so many spiritual writers will get hung up on, which is they think that what they're doing is writing about themselves. Mm-hmm. When in reality, I think you have to approach this just like everyone who has a business or is doing some kind of marketing. It's like you have to put yourself in the customer's shoes.
Yeah.
And how am I trying to serve them? How am I trying to help them? How am I trying to benefit them in some way? And if you can't really put your finger well on that, I think that's a really dangerous thing to do. Yeah,
I've got a very good example of how this works. And this comes from a workshop I did a few years ago. Someone was talking about wanting to write a book for someone who has lost a spouse, like a widow or a widower. And so I turned it around. I said, well, and this person had gone through that, of course, so that's why she was writing a book about it. But what she was writing was, pretty long chapters, and it got rather theological in places and all of this. And I said, okay, what kind of books did you read when you went through this loss? And what kind of book did you feel like reading? And she realized, well, it had to be short chapters because my attention span was horrible. And what we discovered is that she was writing the book having gone through her grieving process. And the book was now the wisdom that she had after having gone through it. But that wisdom is pretty much unimportant to a person who's still going through the process. So she was writing a book not for a person who was grieving, but for a person who's already been through it. And it's like a light bulb went on over her head when she realized, oh, I see what you mean now. I mean, I need to write the book that I wished I could have had when I was going through my grief. And this is not that book. So, putting yourself in the place of the person, and you have to ask yourself, what does this person need? And how is she or he able to take it in? And that will, boy, that will really help us shift our view of what we're writing, because we often are writing from a very later spot on the continuum of experience. And so what we're writing is not really appropriate to the person who's further back and on that continuum. So something as simple as asking yourself, okay, well, when I was going through that, what book did I want, but that wasn't there? You know, what would I have been willing to read at that time? And no, I would not have been willing to read a 250-page book. I would have been willing to read a 100-page book that had short entries for like every day. But that's it. So, you know, that's a really good example of how you adjust it for the reader, and you have to really back off from what you are so, you know, what's really gratifying for you to write now often is not what the reader really needs in that experience.
And so often I think, you know, people have, we all have a lot of interest, a lot of, you know, broad spectrum of things that we'd like to say, but those can be separate books.
Oh, often they should be. They should be. And, you know, in the age now of blogs and, you know, online reading, people reading on their phones, even the way we, I mean, the way we put things together has to be different now. You can't have pages of paragraphs with no break anymore. I mean, we all grew, people your age and my age, Brian, we grew up reading, you know, tomes of books with no subheadings or anything. You just read. You can't put together books the same way as you used to, because people's reading experience has been so altered by the new kinds of technology. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm not making a judgment about it. It's just the way it is. So even looking at the format of something is really important when you're trying to reach a market.
Well, Vinita, I really want to thank you for joining us and sharing us the wealth of wisdom and experience. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, Vinita is one of the most, you know, highly respected editors in this field. So please take everything that she says and rethink it again, you know, for yourself, because
yes.
I highly recommend it. So we'll be having another webinar later today, one tomorrow. And so thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.